Can we find new evidence to solve the mystery of the princess in the tower? Well, I have at least an idea for a project that might achieve it, even without a DNA test of the bones, which would undoubtedly help a lot and could save many hours of work. Furthermore, I will present a theory about what happened, what seems plausible to me, but I don't claim that this is the truth. It's just a theory based on my idea, which I worked out as a kind of proof of concept. If you're here just to hear the new thoughts on the Princess in the Tower and my theory, but aren't interested in the project idea, you should skip to the chapters 5 and 6. If you want to find out everything in detail, I advise you to watch the video in full. Let's begin. Even their harshest critics have to concede one thing to Philippa Langley and the Ricardians. They are at least trying to find new evidence about the fate of the princess in the tower. And although I don't see things the same way as Langley on almost any point after reading her latest book and watching the documentary aired on Channel 4, I respect that fact. As a PhD historian specializing in late medieval history, I have therefore been working hard on a project idea for some time, using more university resources and expertise from colleagues than I wanted to be able to propose a project that I think has a better chance of actually finding new evidence that will help us than Langley's latest attempt. However, the project cannot be implemented by a single person, and certainly not in the few weeks that have passed since the broadcast. To be very clear, I cannot and will not make any ultimate statements about the fate of the princess in the tower in this video. I think Richard is responsible for their death. I cannot prove it, so I will always make sure to point out there is no certainty. This video only presents one way in which we might be able to find new evidence. There is no guarantee of success, but don't worry. This video will deal in a great capacity with the story of the princess in the tower, and I will be showing numerous pictures, many of which you may never have seen before. But back to the project. To make a long story short, we need a model of the tower from the summer of 1483. Here we try to assign all the rooms to people. For example, Edward V is probably to be positioned in the larger chamber on the upper floor of the Bloody Tower. The special charm of this approach is that even if no new information is gained about the fate of the princess in the tower, such a model is still extremely valuable for historical research. In a perfect world, a kind of video game would be created in which interested parties could walk through the tower. The people who are encountered there can be talked to. They, for example, name the sources they are relevant to their location. But this is nothing I can show today. As this is about the princess, the question inevitably arises, how can the tower model help? The numerous theories about their fate are able to clarify this. They should therefore be at the beginning of the explanations. Almost all the theories about the fate of the princess in the tower can be assigned to one of three groups. First, they were murdered. Second, they escaped from the tower. Third, Edward and Richard died of natural causes. As a variation on this, it is sometimes said that one of the boys died of natural causes and the other was released. One argument for this is that Edward V was apparently visited quite often by his physician, John Argentine. I myself discussed the possibility of suicide in my first video on the princess, which was the first video I've ever made. At least Edward is portrayed as clearly depressed in the sources. However, I don't think this scenario is likely. In terms of murder, Richard III, Buckingham, Henry VII, and Margaret Beaufort are the, in quotation mark, usual suspects. Other names are also hotly debated. The various solutions on what happened to the bodies are also interesting. Nathan Amin, for example, is convinced that they were dumped in the Thames. The murder was ordered by Richard in order to secure the crown for his son. He thought it was, in quotation marks, the right thing to do, Amin argues. Non-human perpetrators have also been named. The princess could therefore have been killed by some of the beasts that lived in the menagerie in the tower at the time. There were repeated documented accidents with the animals, which also led to death. The animals are also mentioned as a potential solution when it comes to disposing of the bodies. Other theories, although very far-fetched in my eyes, revolve around the idea that the boys may have been executed under other names. Perhaps they lay in graves on the tower site under these other names, or the graves are furnished in a corresponding manner. Those who think that the princes have escaped are quick to point to the two pretenders, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. This is the solution last proposed by Langley and the Ricardians. Before that, they assumed that Edward spent his life in anonymity under the name John Evans. This is the alternative to the pretenders. They escaped or were released and lived somewhere in anonymity until the end of their days. The theories are all extremely contradictory, and as we currently have no bodies, it is easy to find arguments for the different versions. When evaluating a theory, it is often less about evidence and more about how plausible the assumptions are. The evidence we have at our disposal is too contradictory to allow them to play a decisive role. And this is precisely where the lever must be applied. What is needed is a tool that helps us to assess the plausibilities of the theories, taking the sources into account. Such a tool must have a common starting point that is identical for all theories. Only then can we compare and evaluate them in a structured way. There's only one common denominator, the Tower of London. The last thing we really know for sure about the princes is that they were in the tower together. The last associated date we know is June 16th, 1483, when Elizabeth Woodville left her younger son Richard in the care of his uncle of the same name. He was then taken to his brother. But it is not completely unchallenged that this date is correct in this way. Polydore Vergil writes that the two brothers were already united on this day. There were subsequent sightings. It is known that the two boys are said to have played and practiced archery together in the tower courtyard. However, we have no dates for these sightings. Whatever happened to them is therefore likely to have taken place in the summer of 1483. The conventional wisdom when it comes to the perpetration of Richard III, for example, is that it was late July or early August 1483, after an attempt to free the boys was revealed. My theory disagrees with that, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. What we need to know to have any chance of learning more about the fate of the boys is who was in the tower when and where. At first glance, this seems overwhelming. According to a 2011 count, the entire complex has around 1,000 rooms. 500 of these are permanently occupied. These numbers may have been slightly lower in 1483, but only just. But the number relevant to us is much lower. The 1,000 rooms include all the barracks. However, we are primarily interested in the fortifications. We can assume that all the important people were housed or locked up as securely as possible, and that means behind tower walls. The entire Tower of London complex is made up of 21 towers, each of which probably had 6 to 10 rooms based on what we know from the original construction plans and what the buildings look like today. So there are 100 to 200 rooms that are primarily of interest. However, we should not completely lose sight of the other buildings. We know of examples from the Tudor period where important prisoners were no longer locked up in one of the towers, but in one of those barracks. Or new houses that were built. Yes, I'm thinking about Anne Boleyn. However, anyone looking at the tower as a historical source is quickly confronted with two problems. Firstly, the complex has undergone massive changes over the centuries. In some cases, this was forced. In 1841, for example, there was a devastating fire on the north side of the complex, which broke out in the armory. The version of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula that is of interest to us fell victim to a fire in 1512. It was located slightly further north than the current building, which dates back to Henry VIII. However, the location is unlikely to be very different, as a grave from 1350, for example, was found in the burial area of the current chapel. The tower has also been deliberately rebuilt time and again in order to modernize it and adapt it to the requirements of the time. A good example is the 19th century building in which the crown jewels are stored today. Clarity and comprehensibility were by no means always the order of the day. It is also a military facility that was still actively used as such during the Second World War. It was and is not in England's interest for the entire complex to be easy to survey. Secondly, the interiors were therefore repeatedly redesigned. I will show you a few pictures from the Bloody Tower through history, which show how extensive the redesigns were. The room layouts were changed again and again. As a result, the number of secrets in the tower is still growing even in our own days. One example is the face in the Bloody Tower, which can hardly be explained. However, it was created in 1605 at the earliest and therefore is not of interest to us, at least not today. Another example are the skeletons found under St. Peter and Vicola. The fact that the tower provided the space to do things away from the public eye is also interesting for our period. After all, it is by no means the case that only the princes in the tower made an inexplicable fate here. Henry VI was murdered in the small chapel of the Wakefield Tower. The perpetrators are still unknown today. It is thought that the murder was carried out on the orders of Edward IV, and I agree with that. Edward's brother George, the Duke of Clarence, was also executed in the tower. Legend has it that he was drowned in a barrel of wine. However, this is not confirmed. The same applies to the location of the execution, which was carried out on February 18th, 1478. The Boyar Tower is often mentioned. However, Lucy Hutchinson moved the scene to the Bloody Tower in her memoirs for her husband, Colonel John Hutchinson. She was the daughter of Sir Alan Apsley, the lieutenant of the tower in the Charles I reign. It is at least reasonable to assume that she may have had access to more information than is available to us today. So the tower in its present form is therefore of very limited value to us. Theoretically, this problem could be compensated for by using a plan of the tower from the time of the princes to recreate it in a historically appropriate manner. However, no such thing exists. We do have a picture of the tower from the 15th century. Unfortunately, it looks like this. It is hardly usable for us. The oldest surviving tower plan that is actually usable dates back to 1597 and looks like this. It was drawn to scale for military purposes and is therefore easy to use. However, the Tudor buildings are shown, which are not relevant for us. Furthermore, other structures are visible that no longer exist today. For example, Cold Harbor Gate and the original Jewel House, as well as the Great Hall where Anne Boleyn was put on trial. Here's a picture of the uncovered foundations of the Great Hall. To better illustrate this, I'm showing a reconstruction of the tower from 1300, which was created by Ivan Lepper. The buildings to the right of the Wakefield Tower are the later Record Office, the Treasurer's House, the Storehouse, and the Ordnance Office. The latter ends in the Longthorn Office. This photograph shows the buildings in 1882 before they were demolished. The Wakefield Tower can be seen on the left. One of the towers of the White Tower is visible in the background. Lapper's pictures date from the 20th century. They are therefore not contemporary and are primarily an illustrative aid that cannot be used as a basis for this project idea. I will therefore use the plan from 1597 as the basis for further explanations, even if the plan does not fit 100%, but it is the best we have at the moment. However, this map lacks one additional thing that is important for us. There's a lack of life, but there were almost always people in the tower, and it wasn't just about the guards and any workers for conversions and renovations. Until the 19th century, the tower had, as mentioned, the menagerie where wild animals could be seen. It served as an attraction for many people. Coins were also minted at the site. The Royal Mint was located between the inner and the outer walls to the west of the complex, which is still known today as Mint Street. It was therefore directly adjacent to the Byward and the bell tower. Visitors arrived and left the complex here. The menagerie was also nearby. In other words, there was a very good chance of being seen here. The mint did not work all the time and not at night, but in summer in particularly, it was active for a long time due to the daylight. And it was particularly in demand when coins with the face of the new king were to be minted. In our case with Edward V and Richard III, we are potentially talking about two monarchs for whom coins were made. We must assume that the tower was therefore very busy in this area. The model has to reflect this, how easily or difficultly people could be seen from there. And another note. I positioned the execution site for Lord Hastings roughly where the memorial to the executed persons is today. We know that Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey, for example, were executed on the north side of the White Tower. I came to this conclusion due to the sources. For example, Thomas More states, so he was brought forth into the green beside the chapel within the tower, and his head laid down upon a long lock of timber, and there stricken off. I interpret inside the green to mean that the place in the middle of the tower green was south of the predecessor building of St. Peter at Vincula. Fabian names the inner courtyard as the setting. The lock that was used for the execution came from craftsmen who were carrying out repairs to the fortress. If you look at the plan, it seems to make much more sense not to place large materials near the guard quarters where the jewel house stands today, but to the west of the White Tower, where there is a lot of open space where people do not regularly walk. This brief explanations is also a good transition for the examples that are intended to show the added value of my approach. The Bloody Tower is commonly assumed to be the lodgings for Edward V after he was forced to move to the Bloody Tower on May 9th, 1483. I couldn't find the initial source for this, though, which might be an oversight on my part. Please just correct me if you know the reliable evidence. All I could find was the indication that this is traditional law. At this point, by the way, I would like to apologize for the fact that you now have to endure my handwriting in these chapters. This was the way it was the easiest to edit pictures and illustrate what I mean. There are several reasons why this seems quite logical. The Bloody Tower, which was then called the Garden Tower, was part of the royal complex of the site, which consists of the St. Thomas Tower, the Wakefield Tower, and itself. The Bloody Tower was later also used for high-ranking prisoners. The most famous example is probably Sir Walter Raleigh. Some of the rooms in the Bloody Tower are still decorated as they were at his time. This can be seen in these pictures. Edward did not officially came as a prisoner. However, it was clear that he was under special supervision. It therefore stands to reason that he was not allowed to live in the royal bedchamber at St. Thomas, as this tower is not located entirely within the fortifications. One argument against the Wakefield Tower could be that Henry VI was found dead in it. To explain this, Regardless of whether Richard had anything to do with Henry's murder, the rumors to that effect still existed. Richard was aware of them. It would hardly have been possible to place Edward here, given the history of how he became protector. The public outcry would have been too loud. There are stories that Edward is said to have been seen at the window of his chamber. In my opinion, this must have been the upper one facing the inner courtyard. It is too far away from the riverside. Theoretically, however, it could have been guards positioned at Traitor's Gate on the other side of the Bloody Tower, or people passing by who saw the young king. The inner courtyard window is therefore not completely safe. The reports of the sightings are probably true. As there is a passageway that leads under the Bloody Tower, it seems logical that he was seen here many times. A lot of people passed through the tunnel. However, the windows of the Bloody Tower have been reworked several times over the centuries, as these pictures show. I therefore cannot offer a shape of the window. This is the room now referred to as the chamber where Edward and later his brother lived. It is certainly large enough. Let's return for a moment to the map of the tower and the tunnel under the Bloody Tower. Another point in favor of the Bloody Tower is that visitors not only had to pass through its passageway to reach the actual complex, there was also a chance to greet the young king directly here. The only argument against the Bloody Tower is that St. Thomas would be more representative, but also more difficult to control or guard. This picture, published in 1798, is a good example of how uncertain people were about the princess and the Bloody Tower throughout history. The bones found in 1674 are placed here by the anonymous author. The picture is drawn from the location of Traitor's Gate. According to Mancini, the princes did not remain at the first location in the tower, but were moved back to the inner apartments. This is a description by the Italian cleric and does not mention any names. Therefore, to this day, we cannot say with real certainty where exactly this is supposed to have been. The White Tower immediately catches the eye when you look at the map. The person could not have been more inside the complex. In addition, the legendary bones were found under a stairwell in the White Tower. If Tyrell's statements, as quoted by More, are true, this would be plausible. The perpetrators would then not have to walk across the complex with the bodies. The floor plan of the White Tower can be seen. Above the basement, the floors are basically arranged identically. However, St. John's Chapel is located on the first and second floor above the ground floor. If it was the White Tower, the inner apartments are likely to have been the smaller room on the top floor. On the middle floor, there was a banquet hall and a room for receptions. On the upper floor, two of the staircases led directly to the larger room. It was therefore more suitable for larger events and was primarily used as a council chamber. It made sense for the king to have the easiest possible access. Accordingly, his chambers were located directly next door. The ground floor had this allocation. There was even a small prison cell here. However, this was probably out of the question for the princes, as there were too many people on this floor. Allegedly, only 4 or 5 people were allowed to join the princes. The top floor was the easiest to control in this respect. It is difficult to say whether there was a realistic alternative to the White Tower for the inner apartments. Theoretically, this could have meant all the towers that were not on the south side of the inner wall. The towers on the west border Mint Street. The two princes would in all probability have been noticed here by one of the many workers. The guards were housed on the north and east sides. This would have posed similar problems. Buildings that were not part of the fortifications were also conceivable. Here, however, the princes still have been visible at the windows. The best alternative to the smaller room on the upper floor of the White Tower for the inner apartments is therefore the possibility that Mancini was wrong and there were no inner apartments. Whatever happened to the princess could have happened by now. Mancini reports hearsay and does not give exact dates, and he also states this fact himself, which, by the way, is a very good thing from an author of a source. It's sadly not always the case that they are so critical with themselves. Whatever it was that happened to the princess, it must have happened at night. Because of the Royal Mint, there were simply too many people on the site during the day. As already explained, it would therefore have been particularly difficult to get people out of the complex via the Byward Tower. During the day, however, there was also too much activity in other parts of the complex. After all, the people on site also had to be fed, as there were also other prisoners in the tower, at least temporarily, while the princes were there, and Richard was also there for some time. This was all the more true. To avoid causing too much of a stir, the cover of darkness was necessary. But then the question arises as how likely an escape could be. The Byward Tower was guarded. If the guards were not privy to it, the route was out of question. The water route via Traitor's Gate posed the same problem. Alternatively, an escape via the wall with ropes and the water was conceivable. This had to be done quickly due to the presence of guards and was very risky. The tower was designed to prevent an escape. If this was to succeed, the staff had to be in the loop. However, with many confidence, there was a risk that someone would talk. It was easier to carry out a murder in a chamber and then dispose of the bodies. But we will come back to the subject of escape later. Edward's location during the execution of Hastings does not presumably lead to a resolution of the mystery of the princess in the tower, but has always interested me greatly. And since this is my video and my channel, we therefore talk about it. We know it all started in the council chamber. Here's a picture from the 19th century. For the sake of completeness, I would like to show a modern picture which, based on the display of armor, gives the impression that the council chamber would have been on the middle floor. The middle floor would then look like this. However, it cannot be ruled out that the room intended as a court was also used for council meetings. But this is not central here, as we know that the meeting was in the White Tower and Hastings was then taken outside. If I'm correct in my positioning of the execution site, Edward should have had a clear view of the proceedings if he was in the Bloody Tower. There was an old wall theoretically in the line of sight, but it was and is not high enough. As Edward still had servants at this time, was being educated, and was playing in the courtyard, it cannot be said that he was actually in the Bloody Tower. To qualify this, it must be said that it is disputed whether Hastings was actually executed directly. However, a glance at the map suggests that he could have been very close to the action. This could explain the strongly depressive mood that his physician John Argentine reported indirectly via Mancini by saying Edward was preparing every day like a victim for sacrifice. According to the sources, the other members around Lord Stanley, one of the husbands of Margaret Beaufort, who were not executed but imprisoned and later released, were taken to different rooms. Whether this is to be interpreted as meaning that they were taken to different towers must be left open at this point. The Beauchamp Tower, which was often used as a prison, seems realistic. The pictures from the present day are a reminder of this. However, it is possible that the cell in the White Tower was also used now. All towers on the north side of the complex were used for this purpose. The south side seems unlikely. Richard could hardly have been interested in concentrating any opposition to him by putting them next to Edward and a few days later the other prince. The question of the exact locations of imprisonment is an example for where it is worth looking for further sources to get a better picture of what happened at the tower. Richard arrived at the tower with his wife Anne Neville on July 4th, 1483, to spend the night before his coronation. As was customary on this occasion, he traveled with a large entourage, and there were a number of celebrations, including knighting ceremonies. It is not clear whether Richard reached the complex by land, which would mean Biward Tower, or by water, which would mean Traitor's Gate. His brother chose the route via Biward Tower. Since Richard wanted to present himself as his legitimate heir, I think he took the identical route. We don't exactly know where the couple stayed. Realistically, there are two possibilities: St. Thomas or the royal apartments in the White Tower. The second option would be supported by the fact that the celebrations undoubtedly took place in the White Tower, as this was the only building large enough for this purpose. The couple would not have had far to travel in such case. However, Edward V and his brother could not have been here, if they were here at all. The fact that the couple were able to retire without major problems and were not disturbed by the noise of the celebrations could speak in favor of St. Thomas. However, Richard and Anne would then have been in close proximity to the princess in the tower, as the Bloody Tower stands on the direct opposite to St. Thomas. It remains to be seen whether Richard really wanted this. The fact that he would be seen with his nephews immediately before his coronation would undoubtedly have been very explosive. I therefore think that Richard and Anne spent the night in the White Tower and the princes were only moved later, if this happened at all. Or whatever happened to them happened even before the coronation of Richard. This seems to be the most plausible to me because of the chains of events. Let me explain. Their servants, meaning the servants of the princess, were dismissed after the coronation, which would, on first sight, argue against that. However, part of the whole truth is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were suspicions that Richard at least wanted to persuade Edward to attend his coronation. I hadn't the time to do a deep dive into those works yet. If it is known to be complete nonsense, I apologize. The argument in these works was the order for festive clothing, which according to this reading was intended for the prince. Obviously, Edward did not attend. The question arises as to whether it could have been something of a last chance for the princess. Richard tried several times to get them on his side, even before he himself became king. Edward always refused. Attending the coronation would have made it clear that he supported his uncle taking the crown. So keeping the prince's servants on the payroll until after the coronation would have made sense. Maybe Richard was hoping that his nephews would still need them. A refusal may have sealed the prince's fate, whatever it was. Mancini left England on July 9th. So if the inner apartments existed, they were moved back here before then. Such an isolation would make sense not only to be able to get rid of them secretly, but also to put them under pressure. Personally, I think it is possible that the princes were already dead or in exile on July 4th, 1483. The risk of having Richard and his entourage in the Tower complex at the time as a hostile Edward so shortly before the coronation was too great. The examples of Hastings and later Buckingham prove that even apparently close confidence of Richard could turn against him. And the new king appears to have been quite paranoid, at least in the sources. James Tyrrell's testimony was handed down to us by Thomas More, who wrote decades later. Tyrrell is said to have made the statement when he himself was a prisoner in the Tower. It has been the widely accepted version of events ever since the bones were found. According to Tyrrell and Moore, Richard III is said to have instructed Robert Brackenbury, then Constable of the Tower, to kill the princess. The latter refused to carry out this task. Instead, Richard instructed Tyrrell to obtain the keys to the boys' chambers from Brackenbury and murder the boys. Tyrrell delegated the bloody part of the deed to Miles Forrest, one of the boys' guards, and John Dighton, who worked in his household. At midnight, the two men are said to have entered the prince's chambers and suffocated them. Tyrrell then instructed them to bury the boys under one of the stairs of the White Tower. However, Richard is said to have changed this later. As they were sons of a king, they were to be given a more honorable burial. A priest is said to have carried out this at an unknown location. The bones found seem to indicate that all of this happened in the way Tyrrell said, apart from the fact that the reburial did not take place. Miles Forrest died in 1484, and those who subscribe to this version are quick to assume that it could be connected to the princess. The idea was to eliminate a witness. Dighton is said to have supported Tyrrell's version when he was questioned. Those who doubt this version do not just point out the fact that the princes are said to have been reburied. Tyrrell was executed for treason shortly after his confession. A confession may have had an influence on how cruel the treatment was that Henry VII meted out to him. Dighton, the murderer of 2 sons of King Edward IV, was spared and allowed to walk. This seems strange. The place where the bones were found is marked on this picture. It is the south wall of the White Tower. As already mentioned, it would make sense to bury the bones here if the inner apartments were actually the royal chambers in the White Tower. A problem arises for the Bloody Tower, as a glance at the plan shows. In our time, the site is vacant. Back then, it was not. The perpetrators would have had to take the bodies through buildings or around the outside. This would have been risky despite the night. The White Tower doesn't seem plausible as a burial site for the murder that happened in the Bloody Tower. Presumably, the creator of the picture from the end of the 18th century therefore moved the burial site to the Bloody Tower. However, they were not found there. If Tyrrell's statement is correct, the princes would almost certainly have been in the White Tower. Philippa Langley has suggested an alternative. She thinks that the found remains are bones from the Roman, Anglo-Saxon, or Iron Age. This is not impossible. There is a Roman wall nearby, for example, which can be seen here. So there were Roman buildings here and maybe a burial site. If the bones are not the princes, there are 2 possibilities. Firstly, Tyrrell has lied. His statements must be completely rejected in such a case. Secondly, he was still telling the truth, but the bones were reburied as Richard had ordered. Then, in all probability, they should lie here on the site of the predecessor building of today's chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. However, anyone who considers Tyrrell's statement to be correct on the basis of the bone finds should always bear in mind that this means that he lied or was misinformed in at least one respect regarding the reburial of the bones. Those who reject Tyrrell's statements as Tudor propaganda because they are handed down to us by More should remember that More went willingly to his execution because he would not bow to Henry VIII. I would say at this point it only makes sense if the princes were in the White Tower. Otherwise, other burial sites, or as Amin suggested, the Thames would be more likely. Should the bones be tested one day, which I very much hope happens soon, everyone should be prepared for the fact that there is a big chance that it is not the princess. In Philippa Langley's and Rob Reiner's recent documentary about the Princess in the Tower, an alleged self-witness account of Richard of York's escape from the tower was presented, which the team found in the Netherlands. The excitement was great, and this document is one of the reasons why the Ricardians are certain that Richard III did not kill the princess. On Langley's personal homepage, for example, you can see the picture of Perkin Warbeck with the name Richard of England. The current issue of the Ricardian Bulletin looks like this, so they are also celebrating victory here. But rightly so. Before we go into detail, let us first note a methodological problem in the documentary. For this, let's listen to a member of the archive team about the source in question.
It was in our archive of loose acquisitions, which is an archive of documents that don't really belong in a collection. So we don't know anything about its provenance. We don't know where it's from.
Unfortunately, provenance is not explained in the documentary. Put simply, it is everything we know about a historical source that is not the actual content of the source. This allows us to use the provenance as a guide to the authenticity and quality of the source, as the Oxford English Dictionary puts it. The provenance was very poor for all the sources presented. For the source from Dresden, I have already provided it in a video in more detail. In the case of Richard's witness report, however, there is at least the reference from the archive, so it is surprising that Langley then says the following.
We think that the original would have been written in Latin or French, but this is a copy in Middle Dutch.
This is provenance and requires an explanation, as the documentary has just previously shown the archive employee saying that the house knew nothing about it. It is possible that this explanation existed and was cut out, but this would be a mistake because of the contradiction that arises. The whole thing has the unpleasant aftertaste that those responsible for the documentary were hoping that viewers would not know what provenance means and that Langley's statements would therefore not be questioned. But now to the content of the source and its plausibility, which we will check with the help of the tower. Let's listen to Langley again. I have edited the passages together.
I was brought to my brother, who was already there in the Tower of London.
Then what happens?
Then what happens is we were separated. I was secretly taken into a room in a place where the lions are kept. Lord Howard came to me and encouraged me. At last, he ordered the guards to leave and then brought 2 other men to me. They were called Henry Percy and Thomas Percy. They swore by honor and oath to hide me secretly until certain years were past.
You've checked these guys?
I've checked out all of these guys.
And they were there at the time?
They were there.
They were in Richard's inner circle. They would have been close to the princess. It adds to the credibility and the reliability of the whole narrative.
Then they shaved my hair and put a poor and drab skirt on me. And we went to St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's is a dockyard.
Let's take a look at the map. The Bloody Tower is not mentioned by name, but we can probably assume that it is where the supposed Richard was united with his brother. The Lions Tower is located to the far east of the site. St. Catherine's is on the west of the site. Those who do not know the positions will quickly tend to name St. Catherine's at this time still Kai and not Dock as the place of departure. It was a precinct around the hospital St. Catherine's by the tower, which was given some special rights, particularly in the 15th century. The Kai was one of the few ports of call where ships from abroad could legally dock and depart. At first glance, this departure point therefore seems logical. However, this results in the following route, which seems unnaturally long, especially as Richard was only disguised in the Lions Tower by poor clothing and a shave. It seems to make more sense to take him directly away from the complex in the east or to have him board the ship on the wharf. The legality of docking was probably of secondary importance anyway due to the prominent passenger. If Richard III was behind this escape, the direct boarding on the wharf wouldn't have been a problem at all. If the protector and soon-to-be king, already king, wasn't behind it, the risk of walking completely past the tower with the boy seems enormous. Langley would probably reply that this was done with John Howard's and presumably Richard's knowledge. Nevertheless, every guard on the walls would have to have been privy to this. This seems very risky. This is supported by the fact that, according to the report, there were 2 guards at Lions Tower, but they were sent away by Howard. The Lions Tower location also seems questionable. I show some pictures of what it looks like today and what it looked like when it was not yet in ruins. Incidentally, the documentary also assumes that it is the Lion's Tower. The animated passage proves that. The report describes how a 9-year-old boy was left alone, presumably at night, in a room with dangerous wild animals. At least lions were also present, according to the report that says the rooms where the lions were kept. And this despite the fact that it was known that there were repeated accidents with the animals. The risk of the boy becoming frightened, starting to cry and/or scream seems very high. This idea can also be found to some extent in the source, as John Howard is said to have encouraged Richard. It should be remembered that shortly before this, Richard learned of his father's death, was taken to the asylum of Westminster Abbey with his family, separated from them, including his mother, taken to his brother, and then separated from him too. Strange men were now escorting him. It seems very, very risky to pursue the plan in this way. Especially as guards were also involved. Howard had been Earl Marshal since June 28th, and as such was probably a big enough authority figure to send guards away. But he was not their commander. That role fell to Robert Brackenbury as Constable of the Tower. If the source is correct, he must have been in on it. This is supported by another fact. Brackenbury was Master of the Mint after the execution of Hastings. He was therefore the person who supervised the activities of the Royal Mint and could ensure that the street was empty the day the source reports about. Inevitably, the question arises as to whether Hastings might have had to die because of this, to be able to give Brackenbury control of the Royal Mint. It is supported by the idea that Hastings could have refused to have coins minted with Richard's picture, because he wouldn't accept the Protector as the new king. Whatever happened to the princess, Brackenbury played absolutely a key role. But back to the Lion's Tower. We have 5 confidants secured by the source so far. Howard, Henry and Thomas Percy, and the 2 guards. Brackenbury is very likely to be one of them too. The possibility that other guards on the walls were in on it does not seem out of the question, given this less than ideal route. So, we are talking about a potentially very frightened child who remembers a lot of details, that had to spend time alone with lions, maybe in the darkness, lots of confidence, and a bad escape route. None of this can be ruled out. However, it is absolutely legitimate to point out that it simply doesn't seem plausible. In addition, the document clearly names a Thomas Percy. However, I cannot identify him for the year 1483. Henry Percy does have a grandson called Thomas, which became very famous in the Anne Boleyn drama, but he was not born until 1504. There was also a Thomas Percy around 1400. He was the first Earl of Worcester. There was also a Thomas Percy who died in 1460. This was the first Baron Egremont. Langley confirms in the documentary that she knows that he was there at the time in question. It is entirely possible that she has a knowledge advantage, but she should then clarify who that is. My best guess is that it could be Thomas de Burgh, who was highly courted by Richard III and was a relative to the Percy family. But at the moment, the name is more evidence that the source is fake. One last thought about it. If you consider the source as real, there's the need to have a discussion about the oath the Percys gave to Richard. It sounds a lot like the oath to a king and not just keeping him safe. Why inserting the years in there if it was just about keeping him secret and safe? The years make it clear that the prince could come back someday. To support this, Henry Percy was one of the commanders of Richard III during the Battle of Bosworth. Here, he famously held his troops back from entering the fight. So, just for the sake of it, let's say it was an oath to recognize the boy as a king. That not only would mean that they didn't act on Richard III's commands, they felt the need to save the boy from him. So they thought he was in danger, and Edward V was still alive at this point. So why recognize the younger of them as king? Maybe because they knew that Edward had to die or died in this very night. I am sure a lot of you will say that this is really far-fetched, and maybe you're right about this, but it's at least worth talking about, because maybe Langley accidentally presented evidence that Richard III had one prince killed and wanted to kill the other one as well. Based on the examples, I would like to present my theory of what happened, but it is nothing more than that, a theory. I didn't present any solid evidence, but only offered a proof of concept for my project idea. It is entirely possible that the following remarks are partially or wholly false. I think that the princes met their fate between June 25th and July 4th. June 25th, 1483 was the day Richard was named king. The new monarch was unquestionably anxious to establish facts quickly as far as his ascension to the throne was concerned. The short time span of only 10 days until his coronation speaks for itself. I don't think he immediately planned to kill his nephews. Rather, it seems to me quite realistic that they should participate and publicly recognize him as king. This was especially true of his nephew Edward. His entire coronation was aimed at ensuring acceptance through the presence of a large number of high-ranking nobles, and there were no higher-ranking ones than the princes in the public eye. On July 4th, 1483, Richard released the man he had arrested on the day Hastings made his fate. I guess the idea was that the princes should also be freed on that day in order to take part in all the festivities in a clearly visible way and thus legitimize him. I suspect that Edward refused. To exert pressure, Richard had the boys moved to the White Tower. June 26 may have been the right day for this, as attention was focused on the news that Richard was the new king. It was therefore not surprising that the boys were transferred. My theory is there was an ultimatum. The princes could publicly recognize and support their uncle as king and live as part of the royal family in return, just like their sisters and their mother Elizabeth Woodville did a year later when they came out of the asylum. Or they had to face the consequences, which were either death or banishment. Assuming that the account found by Langley's team is authentic, it does not contradict my theory. Edward, as the eldest, had to die. Richard, as the younger one, was allowed to live. However, the risk of leaving one of the princes alive would have been very high. Just because of the number of people who knew about it. It therefore seems more likely that both boys had to die. This again leads back to Brackenbury, who played a key role in this. On July 17th, 1483, he was appointed Constable of the Tower for life. According to my theory, this would mean that the central know-it-all figure would constantly make sure that the truth could not come to light. On June 28th, Henry Percy was given a title which had previously been held by the younger of the two princes. If my theory is correct, it suggests that there was the ultimate rejection of the ultimatum at that time. The boys were subsequently killed. I don't think their remains are the bones found. I think they are actually in the burial ground at St. Peter at Vincula. The plausible death or disappearance date is June 29th to July 2nd. If we consider that the tower had to be prepared for Richard's arrival, which could have disturbed any plans with the princess. In order to confirm or negate this and any other theory, however, a lot of work has to be done after the completion of the tower model. For all people who have been assigned to the tower, sources must be searched. In addition, personal networks should be set up for all persons in order to find relevant sources through their friends, acquaintances, and families. Unfortunately, I myself do not have the resources to carry out such a project on this scale. If you can do this and are interested, you are welcome to help yourself. I don't have to be there either. I don't have an ego in this, just curiosity about what the project can bring to light. I myself will continue to work on this project within the scope of my possibilities in my free time. If I gain important insights, I make a new video. In addition, I have decided to publish videos at irregular intervals in which I present an important source for The Princess in the Tower and also for the Middle Ages in general. This is intended to give every interested party a bit of knowledge to do their own research, so subscribe if you don't want to miss them. I hate to ask for subscriptions and likes, I'm so sorry. But thanks for watching.